Welcome, welcome, welcome. We're so glad everybody is here. Let's see, we're still waiting for a couple of folks to come in. Terrific to have you. And we'll get started in just a minute. Alrighty. Well, it's terrific to have the chance to welcome you all to our second to last public research workshop for the year. I think we're going to have one more in June, I believe. Is that right, Sarah? That's Sarah somewhere here.
Yes.
Terrific. I think Pooja will be presenting in June, which we're looking forward to. And today we have Glen Weyl presenting Plurality, the new book, with Audrey Tong, a really exciting endeavor. And we are really grateful to Sandy Pentland from MIT to be joining us today as the commentator. So let me just tell you something about Sandy and then Glen, and then I'll hand it over to Glen first and then Sandy. So Professor Alex Sandy Pentland directs the MIT Connection Science, which is an MIT-wide initiative. He also helped create and direct the MIT Media Lab and the Media Lab Asia, which is in India. He is a computational scientist and data scientist, and importantly, also on the board of the UN Foundation's Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data. He is currently very much engaged in collaborations with Nate Persily at Stanford as part of the Project Liberty conversations, and in many ways just brings an incredible range of expertise from the technical to expertise in the policy realm to bear in these conversations, as well as obviously in the creative space. Glen, you all know, I think, is a polymath, an economist by training who began his career at the University of Chicago and is now at Microsoft, where he's had several roles over time and currently runs, I'm not going to get this exactly right, but the Plurality investigative group or something like that. That's not right, but something about plurality something at MIT. What is exactly the name of your group, Glen? So I don't get it right.
Plural Technology Collaboratory.
There you go. I was going to say collaboratory, and I couldn't remember what I was missing. Plural Technology Collaboratory for Microsoft. He is also a repeat founder of startup social impact endeavors, including both Radical Exchange and the Plurality Institute, and probably like 6 other things I don't know about. I won't worry about that right now. But it is a great pleasure to have both here for this conversation, which should be very exciting. So Glen, over to you to present the material you shared with all of us, and then we'll have Sandy offer a brief response, and then we'll open it up. I suppose the last thing I should say is just about the norms of this space. And we do ask people to keep cameras on for these public research workshops. Now, things can come up that make it impossible to have the camera on, but we really do ask people to try to be present because this is about sharing work and thinking with each other. It's not about just receipt of information. And when we get to the conversation, I'll ask you to use the raise hand function at the bottom of your screen under the reactions button under the 3 dots. If you would like to make a small point on what's currently being discussed, you can use a caret in the queue in the chat like that to put yourself sort of into the middle of the queue. So raise hand function for general questions and small caret if you have what we call in physical life 2-finger question to make a small point on the stream of conversation. This is a space where we're building constructive dialogue. So we are looking for the kind of engagements with one another that build and support trust. So trustworthy forms of interaction with each other. And so we will reserve the privilege to remove people from the Zoom room if need be, if there are any violations of a kind of basic norm of respect. So that I think is the general picture. And with that, Glen, over to you.
Thank you so much, Danielle. It's always a pleasure to interact with all of you, and in particular to, oops, is this the wrong window? uh, and in particular to share with this group that has been really an academic home to me recently. Um, I am not going to go over the material that I shared with you directly uh, because hopefully folks have read it. Instead, I want to contextualize it. So first of all, this is part of a book project, and I want to give you just a very brief sense of the overall trajectory of that book project, and I'll do that on this webpage where all the chapters are listed. So the overall trajectory of this book, which you were kind of in these chapters thrown in the middle of, is to tell, I think, a rather familiar story about the conflicts between technology and democracy recently, and the less familiar story of how Taiwan has sort of navigated these and, come out stronger. Then, and this is where the material that you read picks up, to describe a philosophy that we believe lies behind this success of plurality, both in terms of how it understands the world, how it aspires for things to be, and the tools that it used to achieve that, the technological trajectory associated with it. Then, and this is another one of the chapters that you read, it describes kind of what we see as the foundations of this, the understanding within plurality of this idea of rights and their connection to open internet protocols. And then goes through a bunch of those specific protocols, identity, associational freedoms, freedoms of commerce, of contract, and the rights of access. And then it turns to the core of plurality, which I didn't include a reading from, but this is about the range of different technological modalities that empower people to collaborate across social difference, ranging from the most intimate, those that enable the deepest connections, but across the least social distance. So things like digitally enabled telepathy, all the way to capitalism, and the ways in which plurality tries at each point along the spectrum to improve the trade-off between depth and breadth of collaboration. Then we turn to impact. What can this do for different parts of our world? And we talk about a range of different sectors: the workplace, healthcare, media, the environment, and learning. And then finally, we conclude, and we included a chapter from here, with our vision for how to action this in the world, both from a sort of policy perspective, but also from the way in which people across every sector, whether it be governmental or cultural or business, can participate in this. And in that spirit, I also want to show you very directly how people can collaborate in this. So this book was built as an open public collaboration. It is fully open source. There's no copyright. Anyone can reuse it in any way. As of the publication date, I'm no longer in control of what is added to this repository. So I will do my best to take notes here and ensure that all comments are reflected on this issues tab, which reflects things that are important that get action to improve the project. But I can't actually determine whether any changes are incorporated into the project. That's determined by the community. And the priority that is placed within the community on addressing these issues is also determined by the community, according to the people who hold sort of social ownership rights in this, and those are listed here. So this gives you a sense of the range of people and the stakes that they hold that they can use to steer the project. So maybe a little bit different than the usual seminar. We're trying to take the sort of cooperative spirit of this even more literally. Many people here hold stake in the project. And so I would encourage everyone, give your comments now. That's great. Let's talk through them. And, please jump in and address them directly if you feel so drawn. Thank you, and looking forward to Sandy's feedback.
Okay. Oh, that's great. So I'm enthusiastic about Glen's project because, as Danielle mentioned, we do everything from thinking about democratic structures through We co-chair the IETF, which is a part of the IETF that is in charge of the internet standards, and work with FATF, which is the fraud task force for the world. So the whole sort of stack of things. The way I think about this project is perhaps even more contextual, because I like to look at what is human nature and how can we design technology to match human nature in the best way. And what we know about evolution is that we seem to have had the notion of sort of bands or tribes, small groups, 100, maybe 150, and clans that split off as population grew, of up to about 1,500. And what's interesting is that our thinking is very much a social thinking, and due to what's called bonding capital of the people that we share a common fate with. That's a small group, but cultural innovation comes from dealing with other groups uh, through clan structure originally, although that's expensive and infrequent. And that's called bridging capital in many ways. And so both are absolutely critical. We have a dual nature, and not the sort of oversimplification of rational individuals. We've got both of those sort of contributories. It's a sort of ancient representative democracy, if you think about it that way. We talk with our peers, with our community, and then we also bounce that off of the larger community through representatives. I look at history of technology in this light. So, for instance, some of the first uses of counting was to be able to move information from one band to the other, to be able to trade. Writing was potentially invented to be able to communicate between groups of people and to remember things across generations. And the same sort of thing has happened with printing presses, radio, the internet.
It actually completes. It's mentioned to be accepted.
Sorry. And in each case, there are problems that have arisen with the technology in terms of social structure. Typically, centralization, elites, who controls this? Accuracy, is there disinformation? Is there sort of a slant to this? And it's interesting to spend just a minute looking at the history of AI. I have an endowed chair that came from Marvin Minsky, who was one of the people who came up with the name AI. And the purpose of that name was to scare people and provoke discussion and funding, of course. So the very first AI that really caught on was something called optimal resource allocation, won a Nobel Prize in economics. The Soviet Union planned economy was based on that type of AI. And one of the unfortunate things that happened with it is we were then able to talk about everything in terms of money. So there was this financialization of our culture that didn't exist before. The next wave of AI was around expert systems. They sort of figured out that pure math wasn't going to do it, so maybe heuristic rules. And that didn't really work out either. But all of our systems, all of our enterprise systems, have at their heart these sort of rule systems. And because they were more efficient than having people out in all the communities, it resulted in this rather enormous centralization in our society and provoked books like Bowling Alone. We no longer have the power to control our lives because things have been over centralized because of exactly this sort of technology. And of course, we talk about surveillance capitalism, which is sort of the next wave of AI. And now we're at generative AI. And we can think about, well, what can we do to avoid the sorts of problems we saw before? And the accent on plurality is obviously a key thing. But we also have to think about people having agency, and the technology should not remove the agency of the people, and security. And many of these things you can build into the basic fabric of the internet, the protocols like TCP, like HTTPS. And if we can bring them in at that level, then we can make it much easier to avoid the sort of problems that we had before. And I think that's how I interpret this plurality effort, and I hope it's not too far wrong from what Glenn and Audrey would take it to be. I'll end there.
Excuse me. Thank you, Sandy. Glenn, do you have any follow-up thoughts in response to that?
I thought Sandy put it very well, so I don't really have too much to add to that, but delighted to converse with everyone. So,
Sandy, let me just ask real fast. I'm curious. I mean, I think that was from my point of view too, a good sort of summary and overview. I wonder, as you read through the materials, where are the points that you continue to wonder or question whether things work in the relevant way conceptually, or what technical challenges do you see coming from the paradigm?
Well, there are a number of things that are sort of hot button items. So identity is one. Identity has always been something that is sensitive in the United States, not so in some other countries. But what's interesting is that now you can have secure identity, which is important for security, for other sorts of things, but that can be dissociated with these synonymous identifiers or tokens. So for instance, we help set up a organization of banks where they don't share data the way they used to. Instead, what happens is one bank attests that you are who you say you are, right? They don't say anything about what they know about you. They just say, yes, we guarantee that this is really the real person. So it's more efficient, but it also shares your data much less. It's much under your control. And I think that there's some things like that people don't understand about essentially ways to configure the internet that could have really fairly enormous impact. Another we were just talking about before we began was deepfakes. If you can tell where things come from, and this is built into most of the internet protocols, then you can say, oh, look, this one IP address is producing all these deepfakes. That's a reputation mechanism, right? And so reputation has gotten this very bad sort of social picture, right?
Reputation has a bad reputation. Yeah.
Yeah, reputation has a bad reputation, but it doesn't have to be that way. There are certain things where it could be restricted, and of course, it's a very traditional part of human thinking and human organization. And those are maybe the two things that I would say ought to be really sort of thought about, and we ought to make some progress on them if we can.
I'm glad you want to say anything about those questions of identity and reputation.
I mean, those are very core, obviously, in the section that you read the introductory chapter for the part 4, 1 and 2. And to me, like, again, this just gets to the core of plurality. There's this key trade-off between what we call establishing and protecting identity. Establishing means conveying useful information and having confidence in it, and protecting means ensuring that doesn't get outside of the relevant context. And every identity and reputation system has to be understood, I think, with respect to those two things simultaneously being achieved, because if you don't establish information, the identity system is useless and is subject to being taken over by any attacker. And on the other hand, if you don't protect the information, then it also becomes useless, because once someone else has all your information, this is not just a matter of like, oh, I didn't do anything wrong, I don't mind being transparent. Literally online, there is no distinction between someone else having all your information and you not existing anymore as a person and not having rights to anything. There's no way that if all your information is held by another person, that you can maintain any sense of separate entitlement to anything online. So you cannot separate those two elements. And I think the only way to expand the space of what is possible with regards to those is to understand that information is intersectional and belongs to a variety of different social groups that people are part of. And only by sort of fragmenting the view of a person across those different social groups can you simultaneously establish the information that you need to establish and protect it so that you're not, subject to being just identity stolen. And so that to me is really the key. That's like a great illustration of why I think plurality is so critical. That understanding, that intersectional plural understanding of of identities is the only way that we can sort of square the circle of both protecting and establishing the information we need to have a secure
Can I
online.
add just a little color
Yeah.
to that? So often the way we talk about identity, and actually, since we established some of the basic identity mechanisms, we try to push this in the standards, is there's identity and then there's persona. So your persona with your family is different than your persona at work. You're still the same person, but they know your persona, which means you don't have to share data between these different communities that you're part of. People are parts of lots of communities. They want to have discussions, but they don't want to share everything. And you want to have control of what you do share and how you behave and your reputation and so forth within each community. And that's just a completely natural part of human existence, and it makes a lot of sense. So you have to be able to support that.
Great, thank you. Great exchange. So
By the way, the one person I would really credit on this, just to be clear, is Dana Boyd. In her 2002 thesis, master's thesis from Brown, she really highlighted these issues very eloquently. And I think a lot of my thinking has been inspired by her work. So just wanted to call that out.
great, thank you for sharing that. The floor is open. So again, please use the raise hand function. I'm sure there are lots of comments and questions in the room. So. And I know, for example, Kalia, I see you. I know you have lots of thoughts about identity. Maybe I'll just invite you to jump into this last thread of conversation if you're up for it. And please share where you're zooming in from, if you don't mind, as you begin to speak. So.
I'm zooming in from Oakland, California, and thanks, Danielle. Yeah, identity is deep because it means so many things. And I think that one of the parts that I contributed to the book is really putting in some historical context for at least how identity in the West has been conceptualized and sort of emerge out of what Sandy touched on in terms of how we used to do identity when we only knew our local groups of people, and how abstraction of identity into documents issued by states is critical to how we interact with each other across institutional context and places. And there's also the danger as we move into digital space that persistence across all contexts means all information across all contexts can be shared and seen, and we may not want that, right? So how we're at a critical juncture where we need to innovate so that we have confidence in who, not so much confidence that we're interacting with one, real people, two, that we can hold them account if things go wrong in social space, like you just said for this space, like I have the right to kick you out of this space if you're not behaving properly, right? Like how do we govern ourselves in social space and democracy? And then, how do we find our way in new democratic systems and processes? And I think that's what's inspiring about the book for me, is like these questions of how we do identity well in the digital world are not figured out yet. We're still working on them. So.
Thank you.
We'll mention sort of a couple of dangers that are interesting to just to elaborate what you said. One is often people talk about identity as being something that the state gives you. of course, that's not right. And in many parts of the world, that would be extremely dangerous, but it happens all the time. So you want to have at least a distributed sense of who's vouching for you. And it comes from perhaps your relationships with your various communities. I think that's really sort of a key thing that people miss. And yeah, and then also a thing that people miss in talking about this is there are really bad guys in the world, and you know, perhaps under extreme duress, you have to be able to find them. And that's not a pleasant thing because it's not about liberty, it's about safety. But it matters. You know?
Any,
Hi, thanks. I'm Kenny Selesny in Washington, D.C. Glenn, as you know, I'm a huge fan of the book. Sandy, I was very interested that in your remarks, I think I heard you say that there are some basic steps that could be taken within the architecture of the internet that would protect some of the things that, you know, that would strike the right balance. And you almost made it sound like it's not hard, like we could just do those couple of things and that would really, you know, help solve the problem. So did I misunderstand that, or are
Nope,
there a few
you're absolutely right.
Okay,
So
and so what's the progress on those? Like what could actually be done to move that forward?
So my little hobby horse is this: is that you may remember that there used to be HTTP, and then Google decided to rate things differently if they had security. So it was HTTPS popped to the top. That S has to do with an authentication of who you are. It's called an X509 certificate. It's used for very high security things when it's used, but none of the big carriers use it. They just don't fill it in. So what that means is you can say, okay, this person, this thing that we're looking at came from this address, and you can even, by filling in the slots in this thing that already exists, trace it back to a source. That means you have a reputation mechanism. You can say, I don't know who's doing this, but I do know their IP address, right? And you can kick them out of the discussion. The same thing is true in the dark web. There's existing things for anti-spoofing, but most of the ransomware and other sort of accounts succeed in part because you can pretend to be somebody else. The protocols are already there. They're just not used. And so one of the discussions is, you know, maybe all government purchases should require anti-spoofing, so you can't pretend to be somebody else. And some things like that could be, it's not going to solve everything, right? But, you know, it could reduce deep fakes by, you know, 80% almost overnight. You know, the discussion though is that if I can trace things back to its source, that says something about identity, right? I don't know who you are, but I do know what you're doing if I can collect from lots of different things. So there's a trade-off, like Glenn said, right?
Kenny, did you want to come back on that at all? Sorry, Kenny, did you want to come back on that at all?
Yeah, I'll just add two really practical things that are in the works and close to potentially wide-scale deployment is the Content Authenticity Initiative and C2PA, which is working to build sort of supply chains for digital media and sort of being able to trace where information comes from through networks. And there's even a group in C2PA working on specific how do individual authors and photographers and videographers claim their identities relative to media that they produce, and even in dangerous places where their real identity can't be revealed, you know, war zones, etc., but that there is enough reputation around an identity that you can have confidence that what you're seeing is real.
So Glenn, moving away from identity for a second, I'm curious, as you've been sharing these materials with people, where are you finding the most resistance to some of the kind of core concepts?
I haven't yet really gotten into strongly resistant territory. I would say that the one reaction we have gotten in some places is semantic. So to some people, plurality is very associated with the plurality rule in political science. To some other people, it turns out to be associated with the condition of having multiple identities within a single, multiple completely separated identities within a single person, the clinical condition. And there's definitely been some conversations there. Kalia was part of those because even more associated with that condition is the abbreviation that's used for decentralized ID, which is DID. So weirdly, these two ideas that are both kind of part of this idea space are both sort of in semantic collisions with this particular other medical condition. But it's been kind of shocking how little like real pushback there has been beyond these kind of semantic points. So I'm really interested in finding those points of tension. As Audrey said recently in a talk that she gave at Northeastern, there was a time when there was 90% support for the Taiwanese government during the pandemic. And, the 8% that disapproved, she thought were like the greatest national treasure because otherwise nothing will push towards the possibility of hope. If everything is working, then there's no way to improve. So, and that's especially true in our project because if nobody is motivated enough to disagree, no one is going to get in there and submit pull requests. So I hope people will be motivated to improve, to critique, etc. I have my own thoughts about what are some of the stumbling blocks, but I just wanted to honestly answer your question in terms of the interaction we've had with other people. So,
Sure. Well, I'll come back to your own thoughts about stumbling blocks in a minute, but let me bring Lucas in.
Thank you. I'm calling from Boston. There's one really interesting topic and maybe challenge that I thought of when reading the chapters, which is interoperability, because there seems like there's many very interesting ideas and very complex ideas of doing governance that are brought up in the book, but interoperability seems like a really substantial challenge there. And you say that governments will have a large role in this. They'll have a role of coordination of making this happen. And one question is, how feasible is this to have governments coordinate on this, and like not only within their own jurisdictions, but like more broadly across the whole world? And then you also say that mandating interoperability will be important to make sure that there's no like dominion and no monopoly by certain structures, notably private. And I was wondering also maybe there's like the flip side of that is that like how feasible is it for small structures, for small civil society actors to actually comply with like very extensive interoperability requirements and standards, etc. Does it actually maybe make it harder for them sometimes to comply with all these different frameworks?
I'm happy to answer that, but I actually think Sandy has worked much more deeply on these sorts of trade-off questions than I have. So I would.
The most exciting thing that I've seen, we've been working with the person who was the Sherpa for the G20, but the iSpirit group, and they have identity. So in the last couple of years, first of all, India has built tools that street beggars use to borrow money, to sell things, to do contracts, to really be part of the economy, to have a real identity. And that's built on their identity mechanism, Aadhaar, which has some problems with biometrics and things. But they have a toolkit that they've put together called MOSIC, which doesn't have the Aadhaar problems. And they've spreading this around the world. They so far have about 14 countries taking this toolkit and configuring it in a way that's good for their country. And so that use of the toolkit of the open standards open software promotes a great deal of interoperability. And I think that that's a great thing, is to get, the majority of people live in middle income countries now that have cell phones. And the question is how are they going to participate in the broader economy? How are they going to vote? How are they going to get health care? And so they're beginning to really build this and promote it. And I'm very enthusiastic, not to say that it's perfect, but in the last 2-3 years, this effort has recruited something like 2.8 billion people who are using it. You don't know about it if you live in the US, but if you live in Eastern Africa or Indochina or India, you know about it because you use it.
And I would also, and Sandy's maybe too modest to say this, but the work that he and others have done at IETF and so forth, I think showed the power of interoperability with some support from the public sector, but mostly led by transnational civil groups. And that's been accomplished, honestly, with very limited real public engagement and support. And what could it be accomplished with more of that, I think could go much, much further. So I'm quite optimistic about what's possible if people are attending to these issues, if they care about them, if they're focused on them. So,
Shlomit.
Thank you so much. That's been fascinating. I want to take the discussion to something that perhaps can impact more, on current situation. Given that this year is an election year in many countries, how do you envision the concept of plurality and digital plurality influencing democratic process globally? What role can digital plurality play in enhancing the transparency and accountability of electoral processes? And how might governments leverage the principles of plurality to foster a more inclusive voting process, especially for marginalized communities? And I noted that you've been citing Daniel in I think it's chapter 4, referring to that, and the and other citations of the overwhelming environment with many voices around there. In such a critical year, how can we connect that to our reality?
I mean, there are too many things to say, and of course the book says a good deal of them. So I'll try to pick out a few very different examples, and one's grounded in the actual lived experience in Taiwan. I think, the approach that GovZero had of building shadow, actually one thing I learned is that GovZero in Chinese, in traditional Mandarin, actually is equivalent to saying shadow government. So people literally build these digital shadow governments and improve on services. I think that is a practice that it's just a very generative practice. It's like just turning it from we're protesting, we're angry, we want things to be different, we don't know what it is, to here is what we are saying. We challenge you to say that it's not better. I think it's just a great practice, and it's something that's really possible with open source code. So more governments can make it available, and more civil groups can try doing that. A second set of practices is, Polis, this platform, and there's many others, Remesh and All Our Ideas and so forth, are really getting to scale now. Lots and lots and lots of places are using them. And I think they're powerful ways to have more convergent democratic conversations that don't just spiral off in dangerous directions. And the third thing I would say is digital competence education, in particular, the practice of having students, as they are learning, quote, digital literacy, actually participate civically in addressing the influx of dis and misinformation online, I think is just a very thoughtful practice, and is one that's been very important to the success in Taiwan and could be very important in this year. So that's something that all sorts of curriculum developers could action now. There are many, many other things. I will just say one last thing, which does not appear in the book, but that I think is really important. The social divide between the tech world and the rest of society, I think is incredibly important. And a lot of people locate that along the dimensions, the very relevant dimensions of region, race, gender, et cetera. I would highlight one that is not usually highlighted, and that I think we all have the chance in this election year to take action on, which is religiosity. People of deep faith are very rarely in these conversations and spaces, and they want to be. And inviting them in to be part of these conversations in this critical year, I think, is going to be just central to the ability to legitimate these practices. So,
Thanks. Anton.
So I think I have the philosopher's version of the last two questions. And so I'm hoping you'll indulge me. I mean, what's most helpful to me about your project is that it actually does engage with this question about how to facilitate democratic practices, but as it were, from the technological angle. I guess my prejudice as a political theorist is to think that what's primary is what we might call political mores, right? Like political sensibilities, habits, traditions that are already embedded in a culture. And you sort of acknowledge these in what I read, right? You say, well, the European experience is X and the American experience is Y, and the Taiwanese experience is Z. So I guess my question is, how do you think about this relation between political habits and infrastructure? And to what extent are you just kind of like leaning on something that's specifically Taiwanese and then sort of, encouraging us to think that it could be applied everywhere, whereas someone might say, well, in fact, there are a lot of factors here that are, very particular to this island's experience of politics.
Okay, thank you for the question. Couple things to say. One is that I think it's really important to recognize that, as far as I know, there's essentially not a single technology used in Taiwan that was developed in Taiwan. Polis was developed by Occupy Seattle. Open source coding and the Git infrastructure were developed by the free and open source software movements in the United States. The key intellectual influences, we argue, on the Taiwanese experience are Henry George and John Dewey, who are both American philosophers. And as Jonas, if he pipes up, will tell you, many of these ideas, practices are actually much easier to express in African traditions than they are in either Chinese or English. So in fact, they in the African group refer to the project not as the symbol Shu Wei, the Chinese characters plurality, but as the symbol Shu Wei Ubuntu, because the Ubuntu idea actually is much closer than the word plurality is to what it is we're trying to describe. So I believe that Taiwan is not the universal lesson to everyone, and in fact, the whole point is that we need to be taking in perspectives from lots of different places and synthesizing them and learning from them, and that's exactly the Taiwanese tradition. However, people need things to give them hope. They need examples to give them hope. Humans think in narratives and concreteness. And so we need to live in the paradox, I think, of having the particular and the general simultaneously in mind. And as we think about the general always has to have an emphasis on plurality, because we have to think of the general, but the general has the necessary tendency to shut down the specific. And so if you keep the necessity of sort of conversation with the specific in mind in the general, I think that is a key way to avoid this. I'm happy to speak to your broader points about political culture if you'd like. I'm not quite sure what the best entry point onto them is, but feel free to follow up.
No, I mean, I appreciate the point that what you're proposing isn't like just for Taiwan, but maybe I could reverse the question and ask, what are the basic conditions of applicability such that, like, presumably we could imagine some place or culture or country for which this, like, thinking about plurality in this way would just not be appropriate, or like what must be in place in order for this to facilitate what's best about the political experience of some group. But I don't know whether that's
The first thing I would say is I would encourage us not to think of nation states as the only jurisdictional location in which these technologies are relevant. Like, nation states is one abstraction, but there are religious groups, there are civil groups, there are businesses, there are universities, there are health organizations. All of these are relevant things that intersect with people in a variety of contexts. The second thing I'd say is that I think what made Taiwan a place that could be so generative in innovating practices as opposed to just diffusing them was the fact that it is a very diverse place that also has a very strong and present need to come together to address common problems. And so I think that those are the most propitious conditions for developing new pluralistic practices, not necessarily for spreading them. It might be that actually the places that are best for spreading them are places with just a lot of diversity, or maybe just one of the conditions. I think that remains to be seen. I think one thing that to me is really important for being a place that this can be useful is that it has both what we call internal and external diversity. So you don't want the scale of the place where this happens to be so large that it disallows a diversity of experiments, and sort of ends up being top down. Nor do you want it to be so small that there isn't internal diversity that allows the benefit of these to be visible. So that,
can I just add?
Yeah, please, Cindy.
Sorry.
Yeah, you've actually written about the theory behind that quite a bit. So
Yeah, I'm gonna just put something in the chat. So Lily Sai and I wrote a paper sort of trying to analyze things like polis and asking what's good about them, what's bad, what could be improved, where does AI fit in all this? And I just put that in the chat. I think it's sort of interesting because it's very much a political science type of discussion, sort of technology and political science. So you might be interested.
yeah, I mean, I think there are major limitations to each of these technologies, by the way. Like, and we go into that in quite a lot of depth in the book. So there's a lot of work to do. But there is a broad inspiration of a potential direction and a potential alternative to very totalizing other directions that I think has a broad applicability, even though the technologies need a bunch of work and where they need to be tried is going to be very contextual. So
Great, thank you. Tessel.
Yes, thanks. My question is tripart and also touches upon some of the things that were just mentioned, but also throughout this conversation. And yeah, I mainly wonder how you deal with systems that are, or actors even that are against plurality, or even have like no interest in plurality, or even an incentive against plurality. And also, to what extent do you convince them of the concepts of plurality, and to what extent is that desirable or necessary?
I think that if one thinks in a unicontextual way, that problem becomes very pressing. If you think in a multi-contextual way, it becomes much more complex and nuanced. Because, let's choose a bugbear, like Vladimir Putin's Russia. This is a place that in a variety of ways is probably not all that hospitable in some very broad sense to quote plurality, unquote. On the other hand, it is very important to him, given that he lives in a country that is multi-ethnic, that has a lot of internal divisions around language, region, etc., to achieve some of the benefits internal to his configuration that plurality offers. And plurality may well be useful to his regime in some of those contexts. Now, is the success of his regime, all things told, a benefit to the world? I'll leave that to others to judge. But I don't think it is necessarily the case that just because applied across all contexts, plurality is potentially harmful or threatening to certain groups, that there aren't, for each of them, contexts where it's deeply valued and important, and that the opportunity to share that valuation of it might not be an opening to further conversations. So there are many who are involved in this project who assume that others who are involved in the project have no interest in plurality and are shocked to learn that actually they're much more enthusiastic than even they are about it. They focus on different contexts, and each side of that divide sort of focuses on the fact that the other is not interested in it in the context that they're focused on. So anyway, I think there is a very interesting opportunity to harness the potential overlap that exists in this space because of the way that it serves different localized and potentially even conflicting needs as a place to build bridges on its broader relevance.
Okay, thanks.
So Glenn, I'd love to come back to the point you raised just about what you see as the biggest roadblocks or setbacks or challenges in the work.
Yeah, so they range from the practical to the just pragmatic about building this thing itself to the conceptual. Maybe I'll start with the conceptual because maybe that's more interesting to people, but the practical ones are actually quite revealing as well. From a conceptual standpoint, speaking in a way that acknowledges and uplifts the concerns of something that's very core to Audrey's being, like the issue of gender non-binarity. And at the same time, that welcomes the conversations that we are so honored to be having and value having with the Vatican, with Hindu religious leaders, is a very interesting balancing act. And I don't think it's actually that hard conceptually, but what it is hard is to condense it into a very small set of words, which you have to have a broad thing. You have to have the soundbite. And doing that right is very challenging, And I do think it requires living in paradox a little bit, which is one lesson I've learned a lot from Taoism and Audrey, which is that if something is too complex to express simply, usually in the West, you become simplistic. That's the usual move. Whereas the usual Taoist approach is to just actually embrace the paradox and to welcome the questions that it invites, because it actually gives you more space to explain. When people are interested by the paradox, then you can actually get past the simplistic representation and go deeper in. Another conceptual tension in all of this is between different of the types of technology that are wrapped into this. They each have tensions with the others or complementarities with the others that can appear as tensions, because usually these technologies are so hyped that they're pitched as a solution to all problems. And when that happens, they tend to sort of come into conflict with each other. But if if one actually sees their downsides and sees the other technologies as ways of addressing the downsides of each one, I think those can be resolved. But the communities come to it from a point of conflict and antagonism that one has to work through. So from the procedural and building this perspective, it is amazing how rigid the publishing industry is. It is unbelievably rigid. And like, we are doing something which essentially, to our knowledge, is completely unprecedented with this. And why it's completely unprecedented is a little bit of a mystery to me. It's really like the industry, even if you make very clear arguments to them about why something would be in their financial interest, is incapable of processing or dealing with anything other than the work process that they are used to. And the media, similarly, are structured around this notion of, because we're being attacked by the tech world, we're going to circle the wagons rather than be innovate and open and agile to different ways of engaging, even with material that's very clearly trying to be supportive of them and engage with them and not just dismiss them or marginalize them. And there is an environment out there, which obviously is part of what we're combating, that doesn't make a lot of space for this type of nuance. There is a lot greater emphasis on having fights and arguments than on chances to give people hope. And you'd think that Audrey, with her background and all this sort of stuff, would be someone that a lot of people want to hear from. But often what people want to hear from is people taking very, very simplistic, strong, and extreme positions that generate a lot of noise, and not in the attempts to actually see things, through those things. And despite the fact that one of the positions is that we should be doing more of that. So people are happy to like shout that we should be doing more of it, but to actually do it is something that is often hard to find space for. So anyhow, those are some of the structural challenges, and they all relate to the conceptual challenges as well.
No, they do. They absolutely do. I'll put one of my challenges on the table for you, and curious how you think about it. So, in your work, and this is true of mine as well, a key feature of the work is that it's kind of fundamentally anti-technocratic, and about reanimating agency broadly for human beings in their communities and networked ways, and with a sense of where agency is located, shifting away from some of exactly those rigid structures that you've just described. So the rigid structure of the publishing agency is one way of structuring agency, right? The rigid structures of nation states are another way of structuring agency. And you're kind of like offering this alternative way of structuring agency. And, as you know, there's a lot of alignment between our work, and my work is also very anti-technocratic. And yet I can't help but feel that my book and your book both read as very technocratic. Like, we have all kinds of design solutions for things. And that is a necessary feature for you of being somebody who's a specialist in mechanism design. And so that's the thing I am currently wrestling with the most. How is it precisely that people who are so kind of actively anti-technocratic seem to be reproducing a kind of technocratic methodology in a pretty intense way?
To me, the way through challenges like that have to do with a networked conception of, and sort of this open, permeable conception of how things work. If those that are developing technical solutions are, as they are in the West, deeply socially disconnected and divided from the rest of society, that technocracy is sort of an inevitable outcome of developing ideas like this. If you can build more social bridges to people in different spaces, in a variety of ways that connect people in, I think that can change quite a bit. So, again, practice in GovZero is that they have these very open hackathons, and they actively invite, actually, ST is a big, she's sitting right next to me, is a big person who's helped lead some of these things. They really bring in civil society groups, and they really view themselves as in service to these groups in a way that means that in Asia, unlike in the West, technologists are actually on average slightly more religious than the rest of the population. And they are demographically basically aligned with the rest of the population along a variety of other dimensions. So I don't think this is an inevitable feature. I think it has to do with a bunch of social forces, a bunch of historical things. And I think there are pretty concrete ways that we can begin to address these. It's just that proposing policy fixes is just one small part of a much broader puzzle that's necessary for those things to be legitimate. And so, like, not to pick on your book, and certainly as I understand the issues with publishing, I couldn't have more sympathy. But the practice that we ended up engaging in this book, of openness in the particular way that we did, meant that certainly it was not the case that, like, a bunch of people in completely different parts of the world were involved in the core ideation of most of the key concept. But it really is the case that, Omo, who Danielle, Evan David Paul, who was a carpenter from Oakland, who happened to know one of the people who was organizing the event, ended up reading the book more carefully than anyone else at one of the events I did, came in and became one of my closest partners in editing the book, and deeply committed to, like, that kind of relationship building is not going to solve the problem. It's too small scale, but at least it gives a demonstration of what I think is a key social complementary aspect to making the very important intellectual work that also goes on legitimatable and intelligible and co-owned by the people that it will act.
Can I add something to this, which is, I think this is a case where humans have a little bit of hubris, which is that we think we can find the solution. I sort of view this as just yet another thing in a long history that invented writing, dual ledger accounting, radio. All of them had problems, and they were succeeded by other technologies or complemented by other technologies. The internet was supposed to be great. It is great, actually. I mean, there's about 80% of humanity now has an internet connection through their phone. That's amazing, right? And it has all sorts of ramifications that people like us don't see because we don't live in resource poor places. And I think that, what we're doing is we're weaving our way towards a better world. And we have to be a little bit humble about the fact that each weave, each turn won't be perfect. But if we're diligent, we can sort of course correct and get to a better place. And through sort of my hat with the UN Global Partnership and the work I do internationally, the last 20 years, people say, oh, this is horrible. But, it used to be that most of the world was really, really poor. And that's not true anymore. Most of the world is middle class. That's incredible. It used to be, I mean, when I started with the UN, most of the people in the world had never made a phone call. And now 80% of people have a smartphone. That's amazing. They can send email to, the leader. And this is important in political change movements, in trying to get resources to places that need it. I mean, I could go on about it, right? But we are making progress. We're getting better. It's just not even, and we need to course correct. And so let's do that, and we'll probably make mistakes.
Yeah.
We'll course correct again.
Appreciate that perspective, Sandy. Thank you. So we are coming up to the last stretch of our session. The way we always close is to invite everybody to take, a minute or two for reflection. I'll give it 2 minutes to 8 after the hour, to put what's the question that's top of mind for you right now in the chat. And then we'll let Glenn read through those as they come in, and he can pick one to respond to as his final comment. Okay, Glenn? So 2 minutes, you can turn your cameras off if you want till 8 minutes after the hour, and then we'll put things in the chat, and then Glenn will grab the one that he wants to respond to, okay? So whatever burning question is top of mind for you right now, please. Thank you, Jeff and Michelle, for getting us started. Folks should be, finishing up your typing into the chat and setting off your question so that Glenn can take a look. I was planned to turn cameras back on at 10 after. Okay, 10 after. All right, you want to take a look and grab something, Glenn?
Well, maybe just to uplift people, I'll respond to Michelle's question. So in the book, we describe a goal for 10 years from now, which is that Taiwan has the same place in the hearts of people throughout the free world that, some emotive topic like Israel has in the hearts of Jewish people in terms of standing for freedom and democracy. Number two, that people have discovered through plurality very surprising allies. For example, that a trans woman might become a hero to conservative people around the world. That plurality is as available to people as a direction for the future of technology as words like AI or crypto are, and is available to people as a future of politics as words like green movement are. And finally, that people expect, in surveys, let's say, their political systems to improve as much as they expect their phones or other devices to improve.
Thank you. Appreciate everybody's time today. There's a lot of great questions there in the chat, Glenn, so I hope you can grab them all before you go. And Uma, let's grab them as well, if that's all right. But if we could all unmute and give Glenn and Sandy a warm round of thanks, that would be terrific.
Happy to be part of the conversation.
Thank you very much for joining us, Sandy. So great to have you all here. Thank you very much. Thanks for a rich conversation, and we'll look forward to seeing you in June for the next public research workshop for Getting Plurality.